So yeah, Mod Swapper DPS is still kind of bonkers right now. Hey there hunters, welcome back to the Gunners Guild, continuing our series of Remnant 2 build videos where I try to make prisms for our 4 characters, so 28 prisms, yay. Moving on to mod builds now, since I think I finished all my skill prisms, and of course since we're talking mods, two things immediately come to mind, explosives and mod swapping. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Of course, these builds still pump insanely hard, they can clear zones with ease, nuke down bosses, take a beating too, what's not to love? And I wish I had nothing but amazing news to share, but unfortunately, you need to handle explosives with care. Go figure. So the two builds that we're going to be showing here are both mod swapper builds. One's a fast version and one's a slow version, depending on how good your dexterity is. We'll start with the traditional mod swapper setup that we've used since DLC 1, which is the Helix Rockets and Corrupted Meridian paired together. Both these mods have similar ranges, can AoE, are explosives, and have similar mod costs, so they're a perfect pair of mods to piece together. This setup, like a lot of the builds we're going to be using, is going to be the Archon and the Summoner archetypes. Now, the Archon is our prime, but that's really not saying much, as all this is doing is granting us 30 mod power per second, which is cool, but nowhere near enough to sustain our mod swapping anymore, not like back in the day when it was also granting us 100% mod generation. Its prime is just better than any alternatives we have for a mod build, so we're kind of stuck with it. Now what we're using Archon for more of though is the damage perk. 50% mod damage and 10% mod crit is amazing, second best in the game, but also the Spirit Within perk can reduce mod costs by 10%, which is also very nice. So Archon is still our premium archetype for mod builds. Summoner, we're literally just here for the double dip on the mod and explosive damage, can't really pass up 70% damage, too good. Besides, no other archetype really has any skills that's going to help us out anyway. Now the biggest problem with mod swapper is mod generation, because the setup just dumps so much mod power that we really can't sustain it. Which is why I know Tragic made this amulet specifically for me, the Chain Reaction, which is literally a mod swapper amulet, granting us not only 10% mod damage, but 50% of our mod cost is added to our reserved mod. So like if we were to shoot Helix, we get half the cost of Helix added to Meridian and vice versa. And this is kind of what's enabling our mod swapping these days, but even still, we can't sustain it perfectly. Unless you get the overpowered legendary fragment, then you could probably sustain that indefinitely. But this neck gets us pretty close, so we're going to use it, which is fine because we don't really have any other good options, though the volatile cartridge was looking pretty spicy too. Now our rings, we kind of need a lot of mod power generation as we mentioned, so what we're going to do is go with Burden of the Follower for 30% mod generation, Burden of the Mariner for more 30% mod generation when our skills are on cooldown, and luckily having summons active does count, which is great, but I usually just swap my summon to skill to reset their cooldown and just call it good. Also Burden of the Warlock for 15% reduced cost, though you can just use White Pawn Sampering instead if you want, it's a lot safer. Not as risky, but it does break up our loop just a little bit quicker because we're losing just a little bit of that mod cost. I'm kind of iffy on the reduced mod cost in general though, because while that means we do need less mod power to refill a mod, it means we're generating less due to chain reaction. So really the only part that it's helping us with is our little passive regen ticks comparatively to the whole cost of the mod, which I mean it's still a gain, it's just not that much. Now the last ring slot here is the probability cord for 20% all damage, which will make sure it makes sense in a second. I did pass on the weapons, but I mentioned the mods, which is the important part. You can use any long gun you want with a free mod slot just to put Helix in, and we're going to be using the Prophecy Mutator. I used to like this mutator, but now it behaves entirely different and kind of feels awkward. You can't sustain Prophecy anymore since it got changed. Now when you hit 5 stacks, the timer just runs down and casting a mod again doesn't refresh it. So you have to let it fall off and then reset it again to get back to full. So your mod generation isn't consistent, it's a little spiky, which is kind of breaking up our loop at times. But it's still the best mutator we have for mod generation, so we're stuck with it. Corrupted Meridian is going to be using feedback for just a little bit of passive regen, and the other part that gives us, mod power based upon the damage it does is only based on the base damage. That's a lot of base. But it basically means that all our investments into like crit and crit damage don't actually generate any more mod power for us, sadly. Still though, second best mod generation mutator we got. Moving on to the Prism, you'll notice that we have Wrecking Ball for the 100% explosive crit chance. That's why we have Probability Cord. But yeah, while I would love to go overpowered for the mod generation to permanently sustain the loop, with Wrecking Ball, even the messed up cycle does a lot more DPS, so I'm kind of sticking with it. However, there is a big downside to this as well that I'm going to get to in, again, just a second. Just let me finish up the prisms. The rest of the prism is kind of all over the place. We have Mage and Sapper, which makes sense for damage and mod generation. We also have Grip for firearm swap speed, which we need, but you could also replace that for meta for crit damage and weak spots. But we never really weak spot, so it doesn't really matter one way or the other. Pick whatever you want. But since we're not scaling crit chance, we have extra slots, so we could actually just go and get some more bulk with Hulk. And so we kind of need it. The lone fragments we're using are crit damage, and mod generation. You could go for more swap speed, but I don't think it's really necessary, as you're just going to burn your fuel faster and you're going to have a harder time sustaining your mod generation if you're swapping and shooting mods even more. For the traits, it's pretty standard, but I do want to talk about kinship and friendly fire damage in general. This is the only source of friendly fire damage reduction in the game. There's nothing else you can do. And so if you're using anything that does any sort of self damage like Death Wish or explosives, or if you're just playing in co-op, you have to have this trait, and it only reduces the damage you take by 80%. And though that was enough at the start of Remnant 2's life, but now that we got some insane power creep on the prisms, we can deal a lot more damage with our explosives, especially with Wrecking Ball, because now they all crit. But we really don't have any other ways to mitigate the damage we take from it. So even if I were to go like full tank with Letos having like 70% damage reduction, and I still need my mod gen so I can't go full tank, but having 70% damage reduction and 150 HP, I still take almost half of my life if I touch myself with Corrupted Meridian's Dead Point mod. And then you get Stagger Lock too with it, which obviously if there's anything around, is going to get you killed anyway. So that's the kind of issue with explosive mods now. I know it doesn't sound that bad, right? But because of boss rush and all the zones being really tight quarters, there's not much room for you to not hit yourself. Even if you were to take off amplitude, which I'm not running here, there's still a good chance you're going to be hitting yourself in the zone clear portion of boss rush. So you need to be extremely careful with your dead points. The only other traits here that are important is strong back, because I'm going with much heavier armor for damage reduction, because that does help us take less damage from our own explosives. It's just an extra safety net to have Letos and heavy roll, so I'm going to go with it. All in all though, the mod swapper build still performs extremely well. The damage is excellent, around the 5 to 6k range when you consider breaks in the swap loop due to mod generation, and it's still very tanky. You can eat a ton of hits from this on apocalypse bosses and just leech it back up with explosives. I'd say this is one of the more comfier mod builds to play just due to the consistency, but it's scary and you do have to be mindful of where you shoot, especially if you do co-op. In fact, I just don't even play this in co-op, to be honest. But enough about the standard old school mod swapper that we're used to. Let's move on to the new form, which I like much more, kinda. So this build is very similar, but it utilizes Starshot, everyone's favorite handgun, as well as the new mod Void Light. So the interaction here is pretty simple, but it didn't work prior to the update 3 days ago because Void Light did not absorb damage from explosives or anything AoE, but now it does sometimes. And so what this mod does is that it places a little sphere that when damaged will explode and release tracking blobs to hit nearby enemies. And it hurts too. It's like 1.6k damage plus 5k if you fill it all up, and that gets divided amongst enemies. But if there's just a boss around, it kind of nukes the boss really hard, again assuming it works. So of course we guarantee it to trigger by slapping a Starshot on there and just blowing the whole area to hell. And now I will say, as I've mentioned a couple times and hinted at already, it's rather inconsistent. Sometimes they don't trigger, and I don't know if that's an issue with Starshot AoE not counting after the extended amplitude range, or if the bosses are just in the way, or they're not counting for an enemy and they don't like hit the boss, or what. But I just noticed that in boss areas, the void lights would just not blow up, or they would not deal any damage, or something. They just don't trigger. And I really couldn't figure out why. Starshot hits the whole area and it's eluding me, and it works just fine in the training area, so why not on bosses? So yeah, it's great when it works, and it's awful when it doesn't. And so you don't have to use Void Light. I just wanted to use something new, and I would love to see it get patched to actually work. But in the meantime, you can also just run Helix if you want. Those swap just fine. Anyway, Void Light's still excellent. And for the most part, this build's pretty similar to the other one. We're still running heavier armor to not kill ourselves with Starshot. And in these clips, I'm kind of swapping between armors to test out our damage ranges. And we're still going to be using Chain Reaction Amulet for fueling our swapping, but we do have a few different rings. Burn of the Follower is an obvious choice though. But that's actually the reason why I'm using the typewriter with this mod, because mods that do alternate fire mode mods, which are basically most mods, they are affected by your fire rate. So if you have a faster gun, you can shoot those back to back faster. So you need a faster gun, especially to make up for the attack speed reduction of Burn of the Follower. And typewriter is just a fast gun. So we have that, and then we have Burn of the Warlock for cost reduction, Burn of the Gambler for some crit and crit damage, and I'm using the shield alternator to give us a little bit of shield every time we cast the mod. And this is 100% a purely safety net item, so I don't kill myself accidentally, as it does absorb most of the self-inflicted damage from Starshot, keeping us safe. Obviously, for more DPS, you just go with something like Burden of the Destroyer or White Pawn Stampering. The prism here is also different than the last one. As much as I would love to run Wrecking Ball, Starshot is only half explosive damage, and Void Light isn't explosive damage when it pops, sadly. So instead, we're going to be using the power chip for double mod charges. This is cool for Starshot because it still eats 5 charges max, but it does let us fire 2 Starshots back to back if we want. And it does help us recover a lot more mod power when we swap to our other mod, since we can throw 2 Void Lights or 2 Helixes out really fast and then go back to Starshot. It's the only way I can find that I could sustain this loop pretty effectively, especially through boss rush zones. Rest of the prism looks pretty standard for a mod swapper prism. We have firearm swap speed to help us swap a little faster, meta for crit damage, mage and sapper and wizard are all just, big damage fragments for us, and then our spare fragments are mod on everything. While you could go for more bulk to help out with that self damage, I didn't really find it necessary here on Starshot as much as the Corrupted Meridian setup. For the traits, we have everything that you would expect, plus strong back for heavier armor. Bigger Bark Skin Fortify Strong Back just lets us run Letos for massive damage reduction and take hits left and right and not worry about anything, makes us way too safe. Amplitude for sure, just so we hit our Void Lights, and Kinship to just not kill ourselves, hopefully. And then we have Insight and Spirit for some regen. Pretty straightforward. So Starshot mod swapper build actually performs much better than the standard mod swapper because it's just more consistent and it doesn't need as much mod generation, and it's also much safer, which is an odd thing to consider since it's Starshot. It just lacks the stagger lock potential that Deadpoint has. And if I could dial in the inconsistencies with Void Light and figure out what's actually causing it to not trigger, then I feel like this would be one of the stronger setups around, given that casually throwing it around at the target range nets about 9,000 DPS with no weak spots needed, but that's going to be on the broken side for sure, so I don't know if it's really intended to work on bosses or what, but either way, it's either going to be super broken if it works on bosses or not that great if it continues to not work on bosses. There's a broken side to that for sure, so let us expect some nerfs if they do end up fixing it. But I think I'm going to stick to the old mod swapper setup because it has a more likely chance of surviving any future patches, but again, they both work great. But yeah, that's going to be all for me. Thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, hunters.